Okay, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I thank you very much for coming on a Sunday afternoon, especially with the marathon going on just a few blocks away. I just completed the full marathon, and I came straight here, and I didn't win. I came in third, and I'm feeling a little bit down. We did not know the marathon would be this Sunday. We wanted this discussion to take place within the Shiva, the 7 days of mourning for the 11 martyred Jewish victims in Pittsburgh, and that forms the substance of today's conversation. Let me first welcome our panelists. To my extreme left,
probably right.
Is my
even I'm not that left.
is my dear friend Elisha Wiesel. Elisha works in finance, but he is a vocal human rights activist in his own capacity and as the son of Eli Wiesel, who is a dear friend of ours, whom we all miss very much. And Elisha and his family live in the neighborhood, and he's someone I look up to. He serves as a mentor and a guide to me on many things, and I'm thank you very much for taking time from your family on a Sunday to join us. Dr. Qanta Ahmed is someone who I met just last week, actually, on a Fox News panel. And we discussed the tragedy in Pittsburgh. She is a doctor who spent a number of years working in Saudi Arabia. I'm assuming treating women primarily in Saudi Arabia, men and women. That's very interesting. And wrote a book about it called?
In the Lands of Invisible Women.
In the Lands of Invisible Women. And I'm assuming it's available at fine bookstores everywhere.
It certainly is.
Okay, well, thank you very much for joining us. I found your comments so interesting that I was very grateful that you have accepted our invitation to join us. And then sitting to my immediate left, again, not intentionally, is my dear friend Bret Stephens, Pulitzer Prize New York Times columnist, formerly of the Wall Street Journal. He was my editor at the Jerusalem Post when at a very young age he served as editor-in-chief. I just want to express my gratitude to the panelists, all of whom have agreed to appear without any fee whatsoever, nothing, zero. We have not charged for this event, as you have noticed, because the tragedy in Pittsburgh demands that we have a conversation. I wanted people to come. But for the first time, we barely charge for our events, as you well know. It puts the burden on people like me to raise money so the organization could do its work. But for the first time, as you leave, we are going to be doing something of an appeal to help secure our facilities, and we do want to raise money. We're doing a complete security review right now. It's quite sad that Jewish organizations have to do this in our time, but we have a responsibility to all the people that come here to make sure that you are all safe. I lived for 11 years as rabbi at Oxford University, and as my friends used to always tell me as I traveled around European capitals, and I'm a Europhile, I love seeing the history of Europe, etc., they would tell you the best way to find the shul is just look for the armored personnel carrier, and that's where the shul is. It's quite sad, and I hope America doesn't go that way, and yet we have to find the balance and secure Jewish facilities. Bret, you wrote a column in the New York Times on Thursday. It was much read. I have friends in China who sent it to me. You said there that President Trump's rhetoric was largely responsible, or was also responsible, I should say, for the attack in Pittsburgh. And you ended the column by saying that the president also has blood on his hands. What, for you, are the causes of Pittsburgh, and can you elaborate on what you wrote?
I was actually piggybacking on something that Abe Foxman told my friend David Horowitz of the Times of Israel. And Abe's line was, "Pittsburgh is also Trump." The synagogue, the Tree of Life synagogue in Pittsburgh, was attacked because the shooter believed that the synagogue was in league with immigration and asylum advocates who, in his mind, were bringing an alien invading horde to the United States. And this just happens to coincide with an astonishing amount of demagoguery about just such a horde trying to push through our southern borders. So I think there is a unity, or there's a connectedness of bigotries to which Jews in particular ought to be sensitive, not least because there's not one person, or there's probably not one person in this room who didn't come here, or whose ancestors didn't come here as immigrants themselves, and often as despised immigrants. The fevered rhetoric about immigration has contributed to an atmosphere here in which people at the fringes of society, people given to conspiracy theories, people given to white nationalist politics, can believe that Jews are responsible for a conspiracy to overrun the country with Hispanics and other immigrants. And I think that should bear heavily on the president. There are expectations, or ought to be expectations, for the sort of rhetoric we expect from, or standards of the sort of rhetoric we expect from a president. And the last few weeks of extraordinary demonization of immigrants, I think had something to do with an atmosphere in which an event like Pittsburgh takes place. He attacked that shul, he attacked the Tree of Life because it had advertised the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society as having a meeting there. In fact, it was in the preceding week. He got the dates wrong. But that's what triggered it, okay? Now, I think it is a responsibility for every Jew in this room. My mother came here as a displaced person after the war. My grandfather came here after the 1903 Kishinev pogrom. They did not come here as wealthy people. They came here. My great-grandfather was a carpenter. My grandmother was a seamstress at Bergdorf Goodman, okay? They were despised by a certain class of Americans who thought that they were not clubbable, that Yiddish was a disgusting language, that they were given to all kinds of vices, that they were underminers, that they had communist sympathies, one thing or another. That's all of your relatives right here. There's not one of you in this room who probably doesn't have an uncle or a great uncle who wasn't a Stalinist, or doesn't have a great grandfather who didn't work in the Qanta trade, and now you're all lawyers and doctors and whatever it is, whatever else you are. So the same bigotry that our ancestors met when our families came here is now being doled out, paradoxically, by a guy who otherwise has Jewish grandchildren and who is indeed, at least at the level of policy, a friend of Israel. But I just want to stress something. We want friends of Israel to be friends also at the level of values, not simply at the level of policies, and that's important too.
I'm saying that President Trump did so much to legitimize Israel, the UN, other places, including protecting Jewish life. He probably feels, wow, everyone's blaming me for this when I've done a lot for Israel. Bret is saying, but what about this incitement against immigrants, which is what the killer cited. But the killer also cited his disdain for President Trump for how close he is to K's. I never know what I'm allowed to say these days or not. As a Jew, am I allowed to say the K word? I have no idea, but I won't.
Look, I think the important thing to remember is the fact that Trump has Jewish grandchildren is somewhat of an accident. Ivanka Trump might easily have not married into the Jewish faith. And if that had been the case, would Trump still be as favorable to Israel? Or would the randomizing machine have ended up with some other set of policies? And I think when we look at Trump and that administration, I think we have to say to ourselves and look at the root, is the connection to Israel 100% on shared values? Is it because of family? And is it right for us to simply stand back and take that advantage without being cognizant of the fact that there are many for whom the wiring is not set up so favorably? So I really resonate with what Bret said about the sharing of values in addition to sharing of objectives.
Well, let me press you on this. Firstly, again, the discussion today is about anti-Semitism, its rise, causes and consequences. We're going to remain within that overall theme, but of course there will be some tangential conversations. I'm not sure that Ivanka Trump's conversion was accidental. She went through a long time of studying, but let's put the focus back on the president. He could easily have said to his daughter, you're famous, you're from a rich family. Do you really need to join the most hated nation on earth? Instead, he threw her a kosher. The
Kushner family?
No, I said you're from. I said he made her a kosher wedding. He made a kosher wedding in Mar-a-Lago for her, and he seems to be very proud of the fact that his daughter is Jewish. He has cited it many times. He has Jewish grandchildren, and surely that, and even his worst enemies admit he has a special relationship with his daughter, loves her very much. I'll ignore that smirk from Bret. And then the incitement against the Jews, of course it's coming now from the radical right white nationalists, neo-Nazis. You know this better than most because you gave the Elie Wiesel Award at our dinner 2 years ago to Derek Black and Matthew Stevenson, who you just hosted at Goldman Sachs the other day, because Derek changed from being the godson of David Duke, white nationalist, and became, he repudiated that. It's an incredible story. Now they've turned from hateful rhetoric to becoming terrorists again, as they were in the 60s with Klan. But the demonization of Israel was happening with BDS. The demonization of Israel was happening with SJP on campuses. The demonization of Israel was happening, as I said, throughout the negotiations with the Iran nuclear deal. Iran was saying they're going to kill all the Jews, and we gave them $150 billion. So can we really lay the blame at one party?
Look, there's no question that there's anti-Semitism, in various guises throughout this country and throughout the globe. Whether it's Jeremy Corbyn in England, whether it's senior leaders of the progressive movement or the progressive arm of the Democratic Party who, can sit down with Louis Farrakhan. There's no question, and there's no question that sets somewhat of a tone for BDS on campus and for Jewish students feeling uncomfortable as they practice their faith because of all the intense fire that is single-handedly pointed at Israel with a double standard that very much does suggest anti-Semitism. So all of that is absolutely true. And I don't think that anybody can say that anti-Semitism is exclusively the province of the right. I think the real question, though, is for this particular moment in history and in the moment of this culture of the United States, currently the Republican Party has the upper hand. And what is going on in terms of the conscious blind eye being turned to the signals that are received, even if leaders can say that they are not intending to send them, people that are in that party are hearing racist messages, and they may be getting ahead of explicit instructions. I 100% agree that Trump should be lauded for the strong statements he's made on anti-Semitism, but there's enough there in an overall environment of demonization of the other. So there is a very direct anti-Semitism on the left, where Israel is singled out, yet the causes of identity politics champion every other identity except that for the Jewish people to have a homeland that is secure, where her citizens decide what concessions should be made in the name of peace. And then on the right, you have a much broader demonization of the other that I think invites its own anti-Semitism, because if nobody else is safe, believe me, we're not safe either.
The first thing I would like to say for all Jewish people in America is my enormous condolences are with my fellow Jewish Americans. I think the right words are Baruch Dayan Ahmed. I'm listening to the discussion about our president, but I've been concerned about anti-Semitism for almost a decade as a Muslim who combats Islamism. I can tell you 3 years ago, we met in Massachusetts as a group of citizens to form the Committee Combating Contemporary Anti-Semitism at the Shoah Foundation, of which I'm a member in the inaugural committee. And our concerns were the rising anti-Semitic attacks in Europe, in Denmark, in France, in Germany, and we collected testimony of those that had experienced those attacks, bystanders, as well as people that were victimized by anti-Semitism, to use them to build tolerance. And 3 years ago, never in my imagination could I believe that we are now going to be doing the same process in Pittsburgh. Anti-Semitism is an enormous challenge. And I never encountered it, even though I'm raised as a Muslim, until I lived in Saudi Arabia the day after 9/11, when anti-Semitic remarks were made to me by fellow Muslims who were equally credentialed to me, as well trained in the United States as I am. We were profiting enormously from our American training. This was the revelation for me when I first began to hear anti-Semitism. As a practicing Muslim, I've been raised to cherish Moses, Harun, Moses' brother, the Torah. These are all foundational tenets of Islam, to accept what was revealed to the Jews before Muslims arrived. So anathema to Islam is anti-Semitism, even though Islamic history does have elements of Judeophobia in it, which one cannot deny. What you mentioned, I think, Elisha, is a major concern.
It's pronounced Elisha.
Elisha, excuse me, Elisha, is a major concern is that there is now increasing legitimization of the demonization of Israel. And that entered my field as a professional physician in 2014, when an incredibly vituperative letter was written in The Lancet, the world's premier academic medical journal, which was essentially a diatribe holding responsible every Israeli scientist and physician for deaths in Gaza during Operation Protective Edge. And it was charging that my Israeli and Jewish colleagues were genocidaires in what should be an apolitical space. And that was a battle that I waged with leaders at Israeli universities, and we were able to publish a rebuttal to great resistance. But what this means is there is an intellectual climate in the United States which allows for antagonism to Israel, or antagonism for Zionism, or antagonism for the existence of a Jewish state to mask enormous vats of anti-Semitism. And that has been allowed to percolate in European public spaces, and I've encountered it personally in American universities. So when I'm not practicing medicine, I speak about Islamism, and did so in New Jersey at Rutgers University with a Jewish colleague who's also an expert on Islamism. We were invited into a Hillel, and I was speaking about experiences in Saudi Arabia, but also in the northwest frontier of Pakistan, where I have encountered victims of radical Islamism, as well as people that live under patrons of Islamism. And we were silenced. That was the only public event I stopped speaking at because of the objection of American Muslims who felt that my message was Islamophobic. And I actually had to leave the venue. More recently, earlier March of this year, I was invited to give a talk by an organization at Harvard Law School called the Friends of Israel. I assume they were Jewish students, I don't know. And they asked me to outline what my discussion would be about. And it was going to be about Islamism, Islamist anti-Semitism, and its distinction from Islam, and the rise of Islamophobia, which means conversations like this are not allowed. And I was politely disinvited. 2 months later, I gave the exact talk in Iraq to hundreds of Iraqi Muslims who themselves had experienced and survived the rule of ISIS, which of course is not only profoundly anti-Semitic, but also very much animus towards Christians and Yazidis, and Muslims fated me. So in this country now, it is very difficult to talk about Islamism, let alone its role in fueling and legitimizing anti-Semitism. Now, the people that did the attack in Pittsburgh, the man that did the attack in Pittsburgh was not an Islamist, but it is an expression, a manifestation of more conversations, more demonization, a false respectability lent to anti-Semitic thoughts that only adds. And one of the arguments we made on camera last weekend is that we really have to rethink the shelter our free speech laws give to anti-Semitic speech, which is always carrying with it the intention of genocide in those words. It is very different than any kind of hate speech. It should be a genocidal speech, and it should become criminalized. In my assessment, they criminalized songwriters and radio station operators in Rwanda for the very reason it was an integral role to the execution of people in the name of genocide.
Yes, the Rwandan genocide was all broadcast from a single radio antenna.
No, I always feel like these people say, you know, you're so hard on the president. And by the way, I wouldn't ever subscribe to the New York Times. So you think, okay, well, then you haven't read everything I've written. So, you know, so I wrote at least 2 columns, maybe 3, urging the withdrawal for the New York Times, okay, about 100 for the Wall Street Journal, urging withdrawal from the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, and praising the president's decision to withdraw from it as courageous. Not all readers of the New York Times loved that line. I wrote repeatedly that the United States was absolutely right to move the embassy. That was the right decision. And my basic view as a columnist, and my advice to all of you, is call them as you see them. We are not forced to choose sides. This is not simply, I mean, it might be binary when you get to a poll and you have to say, okay, Hillary or Donald, right? But right now, there's nothing binary. You have to make, you have to say yes to this and no to that. And the point that I've simply made is it's well and good that many of the president's policies have been sympathetic to what I perceive to be Israel's core interests, and in that sense, to Jewish interests. That's right. But that does not mean that we bite our tongues about other things that ought to concern us profoundly as Jews, profoundly as human beings. Look, there are at least three big strains of anti-Semitism in the world today. One, I think, is Islamist anti-Semitism, which in the hands of people like the Ayatollahs or ISIS is genocidal anti-Semitism. The second strain, I think, is left-wing anti-Semitism masquerading as anti-Zionism, but using precisely the same kind of tropes, the same sort of demonology with which Jews historically have always been singled out for opprobrium and more than opprobrium. But then there's a third kind of anti-Semitism, which is a right-wing kind of anti-Semitism, which took a murderous form in Pittsburgh. But it's the anti-Semitism that masquerades as, let's say, anti-globalism, okay? Anti-cosmopolitanism, anti-international banks conspiring with this person or that to denigrate or to diminish our democratic sovereignty. And that kind of anti-Semitism is what we've been hearing more of since Trump became president. I mean, when you think the globalists, when you think corporate international media, when you think international banks, okay, I'm sure many of us in this room say, well, you know, there are all kinds of globalists and some of it we don't like, and there are all kinds of international banks, and I'm sure some of them are bad. But what do you think the David Dukes of the world hear in each of those examples? They think Jew. Okay, these have been from time immemorial, or at least since the Rothschild family came to prominence, however many 200 odd years ago, these have been labels associated with Jews.
I've never seen, I'm only 46, so maybe I haven't seen enough. I've never seen divisiveness like this. People get down to almost hatred of each other based on their political beliefs. People look at somebody and say, wow, you know, you supported Trump's latest action. I immediately put you in the pro-Trump category. Trump is evil, therefore you're evil, and they start making character judgments. And I see it on, you know, with the way that the left is regarded too. You know, you aren't protesting what's going on in Israel enough, therefore you must be a left-wing anti-Semite, therefore you subscribe to certain beliefs, and that person's bad. We immediately jump to character judgments. And I lay some of the blame for that at the feet of this administration. I think that the character and tone with which we are talking to each other now is informed by that. And when Bret says we have to call it as we see it, I don't just hear as regards our discussions and our opinions of the administration and the leadership in this country. I take that and I say we have to call it as we see it in our conversations with each other. If somebody has a particular point of view, can we not do better at treating each other with human dignity? Understanding the reasons for that view, the context, the backdrop, how is this person brought up, why do they have the positions that they have, and then let's go through their chain of logic for why they have the positions, and maybe we can actually make some headway, either in finding common ground or in changing hearts and minds. So I really wanted to respond to that, because I think the call it as you see it has a ripple effect far beyond how we view our political leaders.
Well, Bret told me during the election about balls and strikes. I'm sure you remember that conversation about the need to give praise where it's earned and give criticism where it's earned. And of course that's true based on Jewish values. One of the reasons I have such deep respect for our friendship and for our conversations is that you try to live a life of Jewish values, and the columns you write are through the prism of Jewish values. I just feel that the causes of anti-Semitism are so much broader, and that amidst the rise of white nationalism, which is now, they're terrorists, they're murderers, they're an American abomination. There's so much more that is leading to anti-Semitism that we can't ignore that is very genocidal. We haven't even talked about Louis Farrakhan, for example, calling Jews termites, which is genocidal. And he's officially from the Nation of Islam. No Muslim should be blamed for that because it's more of a title than Islam. But he did share a stage with an American president, and I'm sure President Clinton was in a difficult position. It was a funeral. But I wouldn't go to President Clinton and say, because of you, Farrakhan felt emboldened to say this because you shared a stage. And I wouldn't go to President Obama and say, because you negotiated with Iran and legitimized Iran and gave them $150 billion, that's why there's attacks on Israelis. When we could say that, if we're going to blame Trump for... So in other words, the president may be using incendiary language, and that should be condemned. And we should ask him to finally repeat.
Look at the way he describes immigrants. I mean, just listen to his language. Do you know what I mean? It's not, you don't have to go that far. Yes, Clinton sat with Farrakhan and didn't get up and didn't object, and that's a mistake, and he should have done that. But it's a question of degree, and it's a question of the language that's used and what people hear as a result of that.
Okay, Qanta. Do you feel that? Sorry to put you in this spot, but you're someone who speaks out against courageously about anti-Semitism that comes from Islamic quarters. By the way, it's been my lifelong dream to see brotherhood and friendship between the Islamic people and the Jewish people, especially when I was the rabbi at Oxford. There were so many Muslim students, and they came to us to get halal meat because they can eat kosher food, and I was very close to scions of some of the world's leading Arab families, and we argued about Israel, but we were real friends. And it's sad to see the division in our communities now. Do you think that Islamic anti-Semitism, do you think threats against Israel, for example, annihilatory threats from Hamas, from Hezbollah, from Iran, is that much more serious than the white nationalist threat? Are you looking at this debate in the Jewish community and saying, this is a problem, but you guys can't take your eye off the ball? There's some really big things happening in terms of annihilatory threats against the nearly 7 million Jews living in Israel.
This is such a complicated issue. As I'm listening to my colleagues here, so many thoughts are entering my brain. First of all, Islamist anti-Semitism co-opts anti-globalization, and in anti-globalization it co-opts anti-Americanism and anti-Zionism. If we look at any of the founding documents of Hamas and Hezbollah, and I've only read them in English translation, central to both of them is eradication, annihilation of any Jewish entity, Israel, Judaism, Jewry. There's special punishments reserved for Muslims that associate with the people of the Jewish background. Some claim that the Quran actually says, take not the Christian and Muslim as your friend, interpreting a particular Arabic word as friend, instead of possibly arbiters of one's faith. So I think there are two things here, and I don't profess to be an expert on this subject, but I've read and written about it a lot, is there is in the Muslim world and in Islam some Judeophobia. Even at the height of Islamic civilization, if we think about Islamic civilization in Spain in the medieval period, Muslim rulers did provide shelter to people of Jewish faith, though there was a discriminatory status, the dhimmi status, which was considered advanced at the time. It was not democratic, and it would be unacceptable to any Muslim today, but they were allowed to pursue their faith under those conditions. Many Muslims now, in the 20th century and after, with the injection of Islamist ideology, which is 20th century, not 7th century, decide to throw out all the other evidence in the Quran that we are indeed siblings, that we do have the same values, we share the same prophets, and we have the same holy books. This is all discounted in favor of anti-Semitism imported first by secular Arab nationalists who decided, after being betrayed by European colonial powers, that they might want to affiliate with Nazi Germany, and therefore they imported Nazi ideology at around the time of World War II. And then later, once the Six-Day War was so definitively won by Israel and pan-Arab nationalism was completely castrated, resorted to pseudo-Marxist ideology with the Islamists from Sayyid Qutb and so on, as a wonderful ideology to take shelter in opposition. Now, how does that affect modern Muslims? I can only go by what I see in my family or my circle or my years living in Saudi Arabia and moving in the Middle East for about 20 years, which is the Muslim Brotherhood took shelter after Egypt repelled them for a period of time in Saudi Arabia, in Saudi so-called secular schools, though there are no secular schools. So Islamic education in Saudi Arabia was handed over to Muslim brother ideologues. So many of the attitudes of modern-day Saudis are anti-Semitic, even though it's divorced from much of what Islam teaches us. Now we add to that the arrival in 47 of the modern state of Israel. Muslim Brotherhood ideology, Islamist ideology came in 1928. 20 years later comes Israel, or 21 years comes Israel. Now there is a physical entity and a ideologic, geographic, and religionized anti-Semitism that I see as much more lethal than Nazi ideology, though of course Nazi ideology was genocidal. Why would I think it more lethal? Because Islamists have given anti-Semitism that they have largely borrowed from Nazis, religionized sacrament. So Islamists and Muslims exposed to Islamism believe it's their religious duty, not just to disengage and not take as a friend, but see to the extermination of the Jew in any way that they can. And you would think that this is just somebody on a street or Bin Laden fanatic or ISIS fanatic. But I have personally experienced, and I only recently learned, that you don't have to be Jewish to experience anti-Semitism. You can be somebody that speaks for just rights for Jewish people and Jewish nation and experience anti-Semitism in a virulent manner that's cut off professional and personal relationships and probably cost me lots of other professional opportunities too, in more than one way. Yesterday, I published about the European Court of Human Rights that has criminalized a woman for holding seminars about the Prophet Muhammad being a pedophile. I mean, it's an offensive, profane thought for me, but by criminalizing it, you make it more difficult for me to have these conversations. So when you said that my remarks are controversial concerning free speech, that's not the controversy. The controversy is to be anyone who is a Muslim wanting to expose Islamism and its contribution to anti-Semitism. It is big because you cannot do it at the preeminent universities here in this country without immediately being labeled as an Islamophobe or someone who's making the environment unsafe or charged or hurting the feelings of a multicultural minority.
Well, the Israeli ambassador to the United States, Ron Dermer, again, people here know that he was my student president at Oxford. He actually did say that the United States should do what Israel's doing, which is to monitor social media. There has to be a lot more monitoring of social media.
It's not just social media.
And Americans are worried about stuff like that, right? Because
it's not just social media. It is the acquiescence of the intellectual space to the BDS movement at the expense of intellectual thought. And much of the university centers in America are funded by patrons of Islamism, whether it's Prince Al-Walid bin Talal or whether it is another entity, where there is no interest in exposing Islamism and differentiating it from Islam. So this is a duplicitous and dangerous game, and it's dangerous. The Pittsburgh synagogue shooting was obviously lethal and devastating. Much more dangerous is what is happening to the intellectual minds of the future. And if we can't have these conversations in America and Britain, where can we have these dialogues? And one last point, and then I'll hold it, is I have worked very hard and published very widely in many places. I cannot get an argument on Islamism published in the New York Times. I could not get an article published saying why the Muslim Brotherhood should be designated a foreign terrorist organization, because I was challenged that I had not provided enough evidence. Now, that's not Bret's fault. That's just a
I think
sense.
it's Bret's fault.
He wasn't there at the paper then. But that is a sense that there are only legitimate opinions to have, and other opinions are illegitimate and somehow Islamophobic, which means racist. And the last deception that's going on is the idea of Islamophobia is also a false construct, but it is trying to borrow the status of anti-Semitism. So by calling someone an Islamophobe, they're seeking the social pariahdom of that individual, as if you would call an academic an anti-Semite. And that also strangles the dialogue.
Okay, so I want to...
We use this phrase, I think Bret used it about, or maybe you used it in your question, Shmuley, are we keeping our eye on the ball? That was your question. What do you do when there's a bunch of balls? And you got to keep your eye on all of them, and you can get so overly focused on one that the other one's coming and it's going to clock you in the head. And we have to have a danger instinct, unfortunately, that has a wider radar screen than just one ball at a time. They're kind of coming at us from multiple vectors. And yes, the genocidal threat of a nuclear Iran towards Israel is something we can't live with. And President Trump should absolutely be praised for the work that he's done to make that day be further away. On the other hand, I don't think that we win if the America that a decade from now we all inherit is one that has a poisonous atmosphere to people with different skin color or backgrounds or belief systems. I think we lose. I think we lose as Americans. I think we lose as Jews who, God forbid, we should be seen as having enabled that out of a maniacal issue focus just on Israel. I don't think that ends well in any shape or form for us.
I was discussing with Shmuley over Shabbat my sentiments at the time that, I'm watching America. I became an American citizen about 3 years ago. And I came from Britain. I had immigration problems, so I'm sympathetic to the struggles that immigrants go through. And all that together, I felt that, I'm coming to America and America's falling apart. It's becoming, you can't have a conversation anymore. Everyone becomes, and that's a legacy of the current administration. But I have to say, sitting here and listening to our panelists, I'm tending to swing the other way. That the kind of genocidal threats of Islamism really overshadow what is happening in Pittsburgh. Yes. And that's just my reaction to today's panel. That's all.
I want to ask Elisha to respond to that first because, look, your father is the most famous witness to genocide. And it's the strangest thing, and we can't wrap our head around this kind of stuff, that Stalin ends up being the guy who liberates Auschwitz. Your father wasn't there already because he had been marched in a death march with your grandfather. But, Stalin was one of the great murderers of all time. It's hard to wrap our heads around who ends up coming to the salvation of people facing a genocide. You want to talk about what Chaim just said? You want to comment on it?
Look, I think it's a very valid viewpoint. It would be very easy for us to just be even further divided here. And I could say, you're part of the problem, and let me tell you why, and here's all the things you should think. I think it's a very valid viewpoint. I think when there are multiple threat vectors coming at us, we all have to study the evidence for ourselves and form our views as to which one is the most significant and how that's going to inform everything we do, from how we vote to how we talk about the issues to everything we do. So I think it's a valid viewpoint. I'm not sure I go as far as you do, but I certainly, it resonates with me.
To the lady in the staircase, I would ask you, please wear your Star of David where it can be seen. I had a very sad anecdote I'm going to share with you on Monday morning when we came back to work after the synagogue massacre. And I work with a lady who's 63 years old and Jewish. She puts my patients into the room and has been doing that for about 20 years. And I expressed my condolences, and she began to cry. She's American. And she said, I feel too afraid to wear my Star of David. And I started to cry myself, but for different reasons. 20 years ago, I was a physician in Saudi Arabia, where it is illegal to show any religious symbols other than for Islam. And I had Christian nurses from the Philippines or Britain who would wear the crucifix. And I had to remind them, please hide your crucifix to safeguard them. And I felt appalling because I felt like an oppressor. But to see that climate in the United States now, that people are afraid to wear their religious symbols, is heartbreaking to me. And I actually wrote to the leadership of NYU where I work and explained that this had happened. So we need to wear our religious symbols here. I know that in Europe, many Jewish people, I think I was reading in Sweden, the parents are told, we're not sure we can safeguard your children here at this school. And so parents have to safeguard their children and send them to a Jewish school. So I understand that there can be a risk, but if we start to hide our symbols, then we've lost an essence of America, which is something that is idealized beyond. And I also met with Pakistani Christian nurses in Pakistan who would hide their Virgin of Mary amulets because of the lethal discrimination which is legislated in Pakistan against Christians. So while Pakistan has just ruled that the charges against a Christian woman were unlawful and the Supreme Court has finally freed Asia Bibi, though her lawyer has fled the country because he may be executed and we're looking for a foreign place for her to go, we can't have Americans not wear their religious symbols.
But your father was the world's foremost voice against anti-Semitism. You marinated in his ideas, his thoughts. You're his son. And we lack that today. Who is going to tell us, instruct us, inform us, guide us about these very morally confusing matters? The various threats that we face, where to condemn, where to hold our fire, where to make alliances where they are necessary, where to... I feel that we're kind of adrift here.
It's funny, I was thinking about this in shul yesterday, the Haftorah, the reading from the prophets that accompanies the main reading from the Torah. It's this very interesting part where King David is old and he's no longer effective, and one of his sons, Adoniah, is running around rampant. And it says in the, I'm going to get the Hebrew wrong, but it basically says he was running around because his father had never looked at him and said, "What are you doing?" And it feels like we're a little bit in that time as well, leaderless with regards to moral authority. I got to tell you, I don't think that there's any answer other than, for so long, especially generations like ourselves with immigrant backgrounds, Holocaust survivors, we talk eternally about the work that our parents, grandparents, great-grandparents had to do to survive adversity, keep their faith and values intact, and thrive despite it all. They're no longer here. It's on us now. I don't think there's anyone else to do it for us. This is our time. We have to figure this out. And, you know, I want to talk about what that means for a moment with regards to how we interact with each other. Somebody I respect posted on Facebook this morning a picture of my dad, one of my dad's quotes, and her comment was, you know, now everybody has to go vote Democrat, join the resistance. Look at the quote from Ellie. And, you know, and I really thought, and then she said, and, you know, if you're sitting there in the cozy middle, comfortable in your middle view, now's the time, you have to get out of the middle. And I got to tell you, I don't know that to identify that there are multiple balls of anti-Semitism means I'm in a cozy middle. I got a report from the middle right here that the middle is like full of sharp rocks and I'm cutting my feet. And no matter who I talk to, everybody's angry because I'm not focused on their particular issue. I'm seeing all the issues and I'm worried about the whole thing. But what I want to just comment in closing is, as an American Jew, I feel a tremendous obligation to the security of the State of Israel. The State of Israel is the reason that we will never again have a Holocaust. That's the reason we can feel that way. But I want to add to that, and I want to say that we, the Jewish people, have survived in countless cultures, in countless millennia, because I profoundly believe that we make the places we live and the cultures we inhabit better for our having been there. And now is a moment where we have to ask ourselves not only what is our responsibility as Jews with regards to the security of the State of Israel, but we also have to ask ourselves as Americans, are we really here just tourists? If Israel's okay, but America goes down the tubes, is that really okay? I don't think so. We need a strong, value-based America that we can be proud of because we are American citizens and we love this country and we want it to be the best country it can be because that runs in our blood too. I feel that very passionately as an American.
I think, if anything, we should seek ways to expose Islamism as a great impostor of Islam and a great vehicle of anti-Semitism, and to strengthen civil Islam at the expense of others that masquerade, that are truly political totalitarians. I think that's what we need to do.
Thank you. Bret?
Look, if there's something that gives me a great sense of confidence in the kind of country that we are and will be, it's the pleasure of meeting you and sitting and having you join this panel. I think it says so much about a broader set of humane values which join us across faiths and across races and across ages and generations. I think Elisha was absolutely right that we have a responsibility to this country also. We're not just in it as Jews, although of course we are, but we're in it as Americans. And what we can offer America are a set of values which I do think are unique. We believe in offering hospitality and kindness to strangers. We believe in the value of the iconoclast and the gadfly. We believe in things like a sense of conscience and an idea about truth. And we believe in a set of moral values which have sustained us for thousands of years and which I think are true. And we ought to honor those, not compromise on them for the sake of a political expedience. That's our greatest gift to the country, however you vote on Tuesday.
Okay. Thank you, Brad. Please be seated for just a moment. There were many courageous things that were said today. By far the most courageous was Qanta telling us her age. No woman has done that in America. By the way, my wife just turned 50, and she very courageously told everybody she had her 50th birthday. And I said to her, you should be proud of your age, even though I'm only half your age, that I still felt that there was a special courage. Just to go through this, 30 seconds. Elisha Wiesel is a very dear friend. Thank you for coming today. And your voice is always very much appreciated. And Elisha's got 2 kids, and he has to be with them today, and that's why we appreciate it even more. Qanta, thank you for joining our community. We really appreciate your words. They were very well received. Thank you for your friendship to our people, and God willing, you will see that the people of Islam and the people of the Jewish faith, all children of Abraham, will, God willing, be brothers and sisters and live in peace and harmony together, God willing. To my very dear friend Bret Stephens, you said democracy, this is America, First Amendment, you have the right to be wrong. And I respect that right. Bret is one of the foremost voices in the world for Jewish values, one of the world's great defenders of the State of Israel. He is therefore beloved rightfully by the Jewish community. I respect how he always speaks truth to power. Whichever president is in power, he has always done so. I read your columns religiously, no pun intended. Often I read them on Shabbos because they come out, the second column is on Saturday. May God keep the Jewish people safe. May the hatred descend in America. May we go out and vote peacefully so that democracy continues to flourish. God bless you. Thank you.